The original Wolf Creek was a real standout horror movie for me, with the way that it depicted the brutal, harsh realities of being so far out of your element, potentially hundreds of miles away from any civilization, and right in the backyard of one seriously sick, twisted and sadistic man. The absolute rollercoaster of emotions the movie puts you through, culminating with finding out that absolutely nothing happened to the person responsible for all of these horrific acts, serves more than just a heinous middle finger cherry on top to the viewer. It also sets in the harsh reality that in a place like the Australian outback, this exact thing, or something very similar, could very well actually be happening. Made ever so more disturbing by the fact that the movie was indeed somewhat inspired by very real crimes. But it also leaves the story open. Mick's faced no consequences, he's clearly been doing this for quite some time, and he's clearly going to continue doing it for quite some time. And that's where Wolf Creek 2 brings us. Almost a decade after the original movie was released, and we had our fears confirmed. Mick is very much still up to his murderous antics, and this time, the dial's been turned up to 11. The sequel once again begins with a disclaimer stating that the story is somewhat based off real events, a fact you really wish wasn't true by the end of the movie's runtime, and we're then introduced to two bored-looking police officers stationed behind a billboard with the sole intent of catching speeding motorists. And when a car passes, clearly under the legal speed limit, they decide that this is the perfect opportunity to abuse their power and pull over the car. But it just so happens to be that the very person that they're trying to finesse is Mick. And not so obvious to them. As we learnt in the previous movie, Mick puts up a facade. This eccentric, seemingly happy man that cracks jokes and puns all the time, so seemingly to the police officers, the perfect person for them to bully. And Mick takes it. Until he doesn't, after being told to leave, being threatened to have his car towed, and an attempt at physical intimidation, Mick waits for them to drive off down the road, and then he picks up his rifle. What ensues next is absolute chaos even for Wolf Creek 1 standards. In fact, right here is where we learn how things are going to be a little bit more intense than the original movie. Without warning, the driving officer's head is blown clean off, terrifying the other officer and causing the vehicle to fly off the road. Calm as a person could possibly be, Mick nonchalantly walks up to the wreckage, learns that the police officer might have a bit of a hard time abusing his power on account of his brains decorating the inside of the car, and finds the other officer attempting to crawl away. So he picks him up, renders him unable to move in the exact same way that he did to Liz in the previous movie, puts him back in the car, douses it with fuel, and sets him on fire. In quite a stark contrast to the original movie, this sets the tone for what's about to come next. As I stated in my original video about Wolf Creek, it's a slow burn that took the time to get you invested in the characters, partly because the actors did such a great job at feeling believable, before much like the police officer, gasoline was poured all over it, and a raging inferno was lit, which effects could be felt long after the credits rolled. While Wolf Creek 2 does away with nearly all of that, we're then introduced to two German tourists backpacking their way through Australia, Katarina and Rutger. We see them struggling one day as the roads don't seem to be quite as busy as they'd anticipated until they spot a car, a very familiar car. And as Mick is about to generously give this couple a ride that certainly won't entail horrific torture, assault and death, another truck approaches from behind, causing Mick to take off. He couldn't take the risk of having any witnesses now, and after travelling a little further and hitchhiking a few more rides, they make it to Wolf Creek. And after getting to the top of the crater for some good old-fashioned hole watching, they descend and pitch their tents for the night, causing them to stick out like a sore thumb as Mick's patrolling the surrounding area for his next bit of entertainment. An entertainment he sure does find, as after approaching the couple, Mick's usual jokey, charismatic self comes out in full force, especially as he learns that there's a woman amongst the pair, but his friendly, seemingly helpful demeanour comes to an almost instant halt the second Rutger questions Mick, which escalates to the point of Mick thrusting his knife into Rutger's spine. He then turns his attention to Katarina, who's just witnessed her boyfriend's evolution into a human pincushion, where he forces her to the ground and restrains her arms before it becomes painfully obvious what Mick intends to do with her. That is until Rutger suddenly bashes Mick over the head, somehow still alive and not paralysed, despite this being a technique that Mick clearly has used countless times over the years. So Mick proceeds to get up and horrifically beat the already terribly injured man, which culminates in Mick cutting open his throat, followed by him decapitating Rutger right in front of a horrified Katarina, because I guess Mick's just gonna be extra sure he's dead this time, making it apparently obvious that as well as the brutal demise of the police officers in the beginning, this this movie is aiming for a far more mean-spirited approach that's going to waste absolutely no time in getting going. Because just like his encounter with the officers earlier, after meeting the man for the first time, in a matter of moments, absolute carnage has unfolded, nearly everyone's dead, and Mick's as casual with it as a person could possibly be. Katerina then wakes up to the sight of Mick butchering her boyfriend while joking to himself, which happens to involve an up-close and personal shot of forced genitalia removal, because as previously stated, this movie is mean. As he nonchalantly comments about the disturbing acts that he's committing, Katerina slowly backs up and runs off into the bush, mirroring something incredibly similar that happened in the first movie, and pointing out the fact that Mick's clearly not learned from his mistakes. As back in the first movie, he kept Liz restrained in a room, which just happened to have broken glass littering the floor that she used to free herself, and now he's leaving his victim with just her hands restrained and his back turned to her. But perhaps that's just indicative of the person who Mick is. He thinks he's better and he thinks he knows best. Because as we come to learn later, he sees himself as this sort of authority figure that believes he's in the right for purging Australia of foreigners. So if he is just so full of himself and believes that he can give himself that authority, then sure, maybe he does just think he knows best. Or you know, it just serves as a way for the victim to get free so the story can progress and we get introduced to our next character. Mick pursues in his truck, clearly loving every second of the chase, when all of a sudden, we see from the perspective of a British tourist named Paul driving through the night. He's forced to slam onto his brakes as a beaten and bloodied Katerina is standing in the middle of the road. Amongst the sheer panic and confusion due to the language barrier, and the fact that he's just found this random screaming woman in the middle of absolutely nowhere, she gets into his car and he floors it as Mick begins to approach from behind. Mick pulls up alongside them, taunting Katerina with the bloodied knife that he just used to make Rutger a few pounds lighter, and after taking the pursuit off-road, Paul is able to ram Mick's car into a log before being forced to come to a stop themselves. And just like we learnt back in the original movie, Mick isn't exactly the biggest fan of being forced into a ditch, so responds in the exact same way that he did back then, by grabbing his hunting rifle and exiting the vehicle. And as Paul ducks just in time, the bullet hits Katerina in the side of the face, blowing a giant hole in the other side of her head, not only saying goodbye to the inside of her cranium, but also the person who we'd been led to believe would play a large role in this story. In the process, upsetting Mick even further, due to Katerina actually being the only reason he's even doing this. Barely missing, Mick fires off another shot as Paul drives off into the vast outback, and despite men not being Mick's preferred pick, it's too late. Paul has seen his face and witnessed his crimes, so now Mick's gotta clean up. Paul drives aimlessly through the night, with nothing but the fear of ending up like Katerina and receiving 2 non-consensual holes through the side of the head, with the realization of what's just occurred finally setting in. An incredibly traumatic series of events that have quite literally all unfolded in a matter of seconds. One moment, his biggest worry in life is the fact that he's struggling to get cell reception to talk to his girlfriend, and the next moment his biggest worry is receiving a full shaft circumcision like Rutger, finding a screaming, bloodied woman on the side of the road, watching her head explode all over your nice fancy car, and then being pursued by a psychotic entity that simply wants nothing more than to kill you, has to take some kind of toll on the mind. Which may explain his actions in the next scene, as for some reason he decides to pull Katerina's lifeless body out of his car and leave her there, because I guess he just didn't like the way she was stinking up the place. Presumably the impact of the crash has completely totaled Mick's car. As we came to learn in the original movie, Mick is incredibly relentless when it comes to hunting down his victims, with him managing to catch up to and kill Christy hours after she fled from him, and just as she can see her potential freedom right in front of her. After driving through an endless sea of nothingness and dead chicks with holes in their faces laying on the ground, Paul eventually makes it to a road, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Good, because it obviously means faster traversal back to civilization and help, and bad, because obviously Mick is going to be aware of the only road in the area. And mirroring a scene from earlier with Rutger, Paul stands out in the middle of the road attempting to flag down a passing vehicle, but instead of finding himself some help, he very nearly finds himself as that stretch of road's newest edition of roadkill, because apparently the creators of this movie have a serious bone to pick with Australian motorists. As Paul composes himself, he sees another shot at survival as he spots a lorry off in the distance and gets exactly what he wants, for the lorry driver to pull over. but it's Mick driving it. He takes off in his car, and this apparent supercharged lorry is somehow able to ram his car from behind, before we're then subjected to a scene of Mick repeatedly crushing poorly CGI'd kangaroos to death as the Lion Sleeps Tonight plays, because why the hell not? After an intense back and forth of almost being crushed to death by flying kangaroos and a psychotic lorry driver, for a second, Paul thinks that he's got the upper hand, right until his tyre blows out, forcing him to a dead stop at the edge of a steep hill. Which of course is followed by Mick nudging into the car until it's sent flying down the steep hill, which results with the car having a violent impact with the floor, quickly followed by Mick sending his lorry down the cliff after him, because by God, Mick really wants Paul dead. But Paul manages to get out of the way, and surprisingly isn't just immediately shot dead, as Mick stands above and watches the injured man as he attempts to make his escape back into the outback. Because if there's one thing that's for certain, Mick clearly loves the thrill of the hunt, which was actually perfectly emphasized by him back in the original movie, as he longingly reminisces about his days hunting to his group of soon-to-be victims who didn't quite realize that they're now what he hunts. Paul walks through the blistering Australian heat for what must be hours before eventually collapsing to the ground to drink his last speck of water, as you can almost feel the exhaustion and extreme heat seeping its way through your TV. And right before it's over for him, he's given a glimpse of hope as he spots a lone house before collapsing on its porch. Sometime later, he wakes up to the comforting sensation of a fan's cool air and notices a set of fresh clothes placed beside him. He leaves the bedroom to be greeted by the people who have just saved his life, a gracious elderly couple who happen to reveal the answer as to why Mick actually chooses the Wolf Creek area to hunt his victims. According to the man, there's some kind of electromagnetic interference in the area, caused by underground magnets that creates a disturbance with technology, which in the process just happens to leave you at the mercy of this psychotic killer with no way for Paul to help as he hunts you down in his very own backyard. Paul cautiously accepts their invitation to eat, but something just doesn't seem quite right here, with there being a possibility of this being a Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 type of situation, with this actually being Mick's family. His caution is warranted, but the Texas Chainsaw theory is squashed, as Mick suddenly calls out into the house, saying the pair will be spared as long as they hand Paul over. Well, it was awfully polite of Mick to wait for Paul to wake up first. The old man exits the house armed with a gun, and Mick gives them a final opportunity to hand over Paul. The man declines, and as he turns around to enter his house, well, so does Mick, right before blowing his head off from behind, followed by him gunning down the wife and mercilessly finishing her off as he places the barrel mere inches away from her face. And once again, Paul sprints off into the outback, but this time being pursued by Mick, who's commandeered the old couple's horse. Because apparently, Mick's quite the resourceful man. They don't make him like they used to anymore. Can drive a truck, can drive a sports car, can drive a lorry, can disembowel a human being and remove their genitals. Mick can really do it all. Mirroring the scene from the original movie, when Christy and Liz hide a matter of feet away from him in the dark, Paul hides amongst the bush, almost in touching distance as he passes on horseback. But apparently, Paul lets a fart slip out or something, giving away his position, resulting in Mick repeatedly whipping the man before knocking him unconscious. Paul wakes up restrained to a chair with piles of human skulls stacked behind him to once again indicate just how long Mick's been at this for. And while Mick seems to be primarily interested in women, he makes it clear to Paul that he's been kept alive and not just immediately ended like everyone else who's had the misfortune of bumping into Mick today, because it's personal. In a last-ditch effort to survive, Paul attempts to win over the clearly mentally deranged man by reciting random limericks and singing Australian songs, which surprisingly seems to actually work, as Mick cuts one of his hands free so the pair can share a drink. Because of this, in his own sick and twisted way, Mick's actually come to like Paul somewhat, so decides that they're going to play a game together. Mick's going to ask a series of questions about Aussie history, and if Paul gets half of the answers right, then he promises to let him go free. And for each question he gets wrong, Mick gets to take a finger. Despite the fear and trepidation of losing a few digits, Paul actually does surprisingly well, as in a rather lucky turn of events, Paul majored in history, but Mick's not entirely happy, as he expected this random foreigner to know nothing about his home, so despite Paul getting the third question right, Mick takes it upon himself to remove one of his fingers anyway, because just like we discovered in Wolf Creek 1, Mick is a sore loser. It's like he's got the emotional temperance of a spoiled child. He'll put on the smiles and act all charismatic to get what he wants, But as soon as things start going in the opposite direction, he'll explode into a tantrum that usually entails the horrific death of whoever happens to be near him at that point in time. After getting the next question wrong, Paul asks if he can remove the finger on the other hand, and Mick obliges. Now, with both of his hands freed from restraints and 2 digits short, Mick leaves the room to grab the pair another drink, giving Paul the opportunity to reach for a nearby hammer. As Mick returns, he turns the light on to reveal his DIY art project. Gone are the days of nailing people to walls in the name of creating pretentious modern art, as he now prefers to hang them from the ceiling and turn them into chandeliers. Paul, not exactly fond of the idea of having his bones turned into a lampshade, hits Mick over the head with the hammer and makes a run for it. And as he frantically searches for a way out of here, amongst the literal pile of decomposing corpses, he finds a set of keys and a woman who's actually been kept alive down here. With no time to free her, he continues onwards as he passes countless bodies littering these tunnels, just as Mick lets loose his dogs. Paul finds the set of stairs to the surface, and just as he's about to go, the dogs come running at him before they trigger one of Mick's very own traps, killing one of them and locking the other out in the process. With the realization of this area being booby-trapped, he takes another look at the conveniently open set of stairs to reveal a hidden punji stick pit that he very nearly walked right into. All he can do is hide behind a wall and wait as Mick approaches, and as he thinks he's close enough, he pushes Mick into the spiked pit. Except it wasn't Mick. It's the woman that Paul found alive earlier, who is now very much not alive. Mick grabs and knocks Paul unconscious, before we see Paul waking up in a town, holding a piece of paper with loser written on it. Because I guess Mick did say that if he won, he'd let him free. But at what cost? Exactly like the first movie, it's revealed that once again police searches were conducted to find this so-called Mick, but absolutely nothing was uncovered. And it's stated that Paul suffered a full-blown mental breakdown before being deported back to England and placed into full-time care at a hospital as a permanent residence. And you know what? I'm sure Mick would take far more pleasure in the fact that Paul is now subjected to a lifetime of torture instead of just simply killing him and having it be done with. Because Mick really does just seem that spiteful and evil. Wolf Creek 2 stands on its own, with it not being a requirement that you watch the original movie first, as it establishes Mick as a violent psychopath right from the get-go. However, it is interesting to see how it differs from the original movie, in the sense that the first one was quite a slow burn to start with, before becoming absolutely relentless for the rest of it. His villainous behaviour is almost elevated to a comical degree in this movie, but I feel that it's actually a good way to tackle a sequel without retreading the exact same ground, as the ruthless, over-the-top nature of it all actually complements its fast pace and insanity. You're almost not given any time to actually stop for a breath and to take in what's going on. But then again, neither is Paul, so perhaps that's the entire point of it all. And an interesting thing to think about is that it almost gives a new meaning to the ending of the original movie. Did Ben just happen to escape because Mick was dealing with Christie, or did he simply let him leave in order for him to live a life of pure horror and torment instead? Because we absolutely know that Mick is far more than capable of hunting him down and killing him in the outback. Just an interesting thing to think about. Before we finish up, I'd like to tell you guys about my clothing brand, Morbid Minds. If you like anything that you can see here on screen right now, go to morbidminds.co.uk to cop yourself a cool t-shirt or hoodie. Also, new designs coming soon. And if you're down in the description, why not follow me on Twitter as well? And I'd like to give a big shout out to my patrons too. A big thank you to Dom, Hunters263, Rebecca Pitts, A Dandy in Space, Martin Brannan, Natasha Twyman, Jarrett C. Bees, Pascal Mathis, Fighting the Pirates, Richard McGowan III, Macy J, yes I know I keep pronouncing that name wrong, Reese Harford, Horatio, Raimi Patterson, Chris, Michelle, Newcomb, Dennis, Wade Knott, Ike, Ashley L. Wintz, Austin Wypert, Christopher Butsky, Joshua Torres, Axon Imari, Billy Kyle, Remy, Dimitri, and Fire Goes Fast. A big thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you to everyone else for watching.